Hi, hello, my name's Lines, great to see you. Today we're going to do part 2 of our 2-part How to Draw Furry Heads videos. Part 1 is the instructions, and part 2 is the demonstration. In part 1, we went over how to draw the head, different expressions, different angles, and different species. We started with a basic construction set, how to detail it, then we went over how to do it at different angles, how to express different genders, and how to then do a few of the species archetypes, like your herbivores, your reptiles, your birds, and then also how to break down your own references to do your own. And then we had a homework sheet, which was linked in the description of that video, and this one as well. Now this is part 2, where we take everything we covered in the first video, put it all together, and make a finished illustration, all the way from sketch, line art, fills, background, post-processing. Now there's going to be a video in future, which is going to be how to do things like the paws and claws, digitigrade leads, etc. Now, that's going to be a minute, but if you do want to do something in the interim, I've got a video on how to do the body for both male and female characters that you can do in the interim, and those also have their own homework sheets. Now, once you've done those homework sheets, or the ones from part 1, you can drop them into the Discord. I go through every week or so, try to mark through as many as I can. Currently, I'm doing pretty well catching up after the Christmas New Year break. And also, if you'd like to support the channel and you like what you see and you'd like to see it more often, consider becoming a member on Patreon. If not, you can always just hit the like button, the subscribe button. You can leave a comment there, feed the algorithm. That helps an enormous amount, so I'm grateful for everyone for all the levels of the support they've offered. In the meantime then, let's get started and we'll go through step by step and I'll talk you through the image and explain every step as I go through. Alright, beginning now with the image. Now, one thing I want to say is you'll notice that the sketch I'm doing here is for quite a different figure than the one you've just seen in the thumbnail. That's because this is the one I decided not to go with. I was drawing this one in the voice chat in the Discord, and someone asked that I include the failed attempt. And I thought it was a good idea just to, I guess, give me a little bit of a chance to talk about the pre-production phase, which is where you go through a bunch of different ideas. So the idea I had for this one initially is for a sort of, a domestic sort of scene with the character I've got from the emotions sheet there, in like a big loose t-shirt, offering coffee in a kitchen, just a really nice sort of romantic sort of domestic scene. And the first thought there I thought was, being offered coffees, and also cleavage, which is really nice because boobs are lovely and I've been a fan my entire life. 10 out of 10 would recommend. And what I realized was that didn't really have enough engagement with the viewer. It had a lot of the elements that I liked, but even when I got through a relatively developed sketch, like this one here, I found myself realizing that it didn't meet the bar for engagement that I wanted with the viewer. I wanted it to really not just be a picture of a thing, but a picture that was about a thing, a scenario. So I scrapped it, as you can see there, and I started a different one that had more of a sense of place, which meant making sure I did a nice solid grounding in the background. So this one's going to be like a kitchen counter they're sitting on. I'm doing essentially the same thing, but with more a sense of place, and that was a good idea. It gave me more of a chance to do things like express a connection between the character and the background using the shared lighting of the window that's behind them. And so that's where this one came from. So now you can see I've started out the head shape, the rib cage shape, the pelvis. This is covered off in that video I mentioned in the intro, the how to draw the female figure one. So if you are interested in a nice, simple, accessible way to draw the female figure, I recommend that video. It's doing quite well. You could also watch the men video because more people should. Maybe a tenth of people have watched that than have watched the female video on body construction. So, men need love too. It's just what that is. Now here's that facial construction we talked about in the first part, in the instruction section. So you can see I've done that bridge out for the nose, that flat section along the front, and the tufts on the side that line up to the eyes. And you can see with even just a very basic construction there, it already communicates that form of the face. And you'll also notice I'm staying zoomed out here. That's something I do not just so that the video looks better sped up, but staying zoomed out when you're starting on the sketch stops you from getting ahead of yourself, getting caught up in details when you need to be thinking about the bigger picture. And you can see the bigger picture when you can see it all. So stay zoomed out until you're ready to start detailing, until you've got the pieces in the right place. And so here, I'm doing some quick detailing, and that's that rhythm we talked about in the first video. with how to get the tufts to look organic, how to get the tufts to look fluffy, with just keeping an eye on the piece sizes that you implement. And so just detailing out the rest of the face there, getting the sketch relatively tight, and then doing the cup in the foreground there, and getting the sort of the shape right. You'll notice that since the upcoming video is going to be how to do furry sort of hands and feet, there are no hands and feet in this video. They'll be covered later. The next one will be all about them. Actually, the subject for that video has been chosen by the person who won the most recent server event. So if you'd like to take part in that, we do server events quite often. And then, if you win, typically you'll get the opportunity to decide what I do for the speed paints in the videos, which the next one of these will be one of those. And so there I'm just scaling that cup up a bit in the foreground, just to make it feel like it's coming forward more, and sort of really being presented to the viewer. And you can see what I mean about the difference between this image concept and that initial one. That initial one was just about, oh look, here's coffees, and oh look, here's cleavage. And they're lovely, that's great, but there is more you can do. And there's more ways to engage them, not just with the subject, but the context in which the subject exists. So in this one, we've got the subject is in a kitchen, holding the coffees, and that really communicates that better than just having a static background behind them, like a sort of visual novel would have to connect. Where they don't really have a way of connecting the character to the place they're in, they just sort of have them stuck over the top. And so here I've got the sketch largely done. Now, since, again, this is outside my expertise, I'm not a specialist in Anthro or Furry art, I'm doing a couple of extra steps for myself. So this one here is just doing a bit of a test for the lighting before I actually started out. Essentially like thumbnailing over the top of my sketch for what I want lighting-wise, because I want them to be sitting in front of a window to give that sort of that glowing light radiating behind them, and then having their sort of front face lit by the light in the room, but having none of the light in the room ever get quite as bright as that rim light behind them. And since at this point I decided that I want to have my tonal range be what's on the character, so that means that I won't really be able to see out the window, because I'll be doing the values that I'll sort of cover with what's on the character, not what's out the window. And you'll notice this if you take a photo of a person in front of a window when you're inside. You'll either get the tonal range of the person in the shot, and the window behind them will just be completely blown out white, or you can get detail on what's outside your window, but then the exposure of everyone who, like of the person, will be too dark to make out. So you'll usually get a choice of which. You can do both, but that means you have to have like a really high dynamic range. And I don't really feel like that works very well in illustration. I feel like you're better off in a lot of cases with a lower range. So here you can see I've been doing the inking here. Now, the way I do my inking, and I do have a video on inking if that's something you'd like to have a look at, is I'll do my first pass with the same brush I use for sketching actually, which is just the soft airbrush with the softness turned off, and I'll just put a lot of smoothing on it. Just because I don't have very steady hands, you can get the same result without smoothing by just sort of long, confident strokes. That's not something I have the option of myself, but it does definitely work if that's something you're able to do. I unavoidably have to use the smoothing, unfortunately. I'd like not to, but it is what it is. And so that's what I'll use for my naive inking. And then after this, you'll see I'll go over it with a second layer of inking to thicken parts of it up or fill in bits of black, like the eyelashes there. But here, I'm just doing the naive line art, and trying to remember that some of the sketching lines there, they're not for line art, they're for tone. So for instance, you can see some of the lines I've put on the front of the shirt there. Those aren't going to get line art, they're going to be a guideline for me later for where to put some shading, because not every line you put in your sketch is there to describe the edge of an object. Sometimes it's there to describe the edge of a shadow or just the edge of a surface. So now, with that done, I'm going to put in my flats before I thicken the line art up. The reason for this is I plan to do colored line art, and it's easy to do colored line art if you have essentially thicker flats. I can't go into exactly why that is right now, but essentially if you are wanting to do colored line art with the method I used in the line art video, which I've already linked, so feel free to pop back and have a look at that, it'll actually work a little better if you do your flat fills before you do your line art thickening there, just because of how the color will fill in all the gaps, and if you have thicker bits of ink, it has trouble getting to those edges. But again, you'll see when I get to the coloring the line art stage in this one, because I do want to have a very soft look to this, and colored line art can be really good for softening an image. And so here I'm just going over and filling in with all the colors that I'm using, so just very basic ones. You'll notice that the color of the character is all one pink. I do want to end up with some different tones, but I'm going to use a separate layer for those colors rather than just the straight flats. Essentially the same way I would do skin tone variation on a non-furry character, I'll have that added to the flats layer. So here I've colored my naive line art, and you can see I've got a new layer on top, and this is where I'm adding some thickness, some extra black, and I'm adding thickness to where there'd be little crease spots where it'd get darker, like, you know, in the edges of two sort of tufts or behind the corners of things. Essentially ambient occlusion is where I'll put these extra bits of line art, and that helps me get a lot of depth in my line art if I'm in a section that, for instance, doesn't have a lot of shading going on. Maybe it's fully lit, maybe it's fully shaded, but I've still got a way of showing a lot of depth using the difference in the thickness of my line art. So it's definitely an advantage to take, something to take advantage of. So here I'm just doing a bit more on the hands and around the hair. If you've got a lot of hair, you'll find yourself doing a lot of the line art thickening if it's something you choose to do. The line art video also has homework. All my videos have homework. But if you want to have a go at that and, you know, have a red hot go at it, pop it in the Discord. And I can, you know, I do still manage to mark or at least sort of give feedback on all of them. And here I'm filling in the whites of the eyes. And you notice I turned off the paper color to do that. One of the things that I'll always miss is I'll have areas that are white because I've forgotten to shade them, not because I've filled them in white. And so here, I've got a layer on top of my flats that I'm using to put in the paler pink color that I want to sort of use to differentiate the hair from the rest of the body. I had a bit of confusion there with whether I should have a bit of hair between the forehead and the ear. And here I'm going over and getting a sort of more warm sort of cream color for the paler sections of fur around the face. I ended up not going with a little bit above the eyes because I wanted to have them a bit darker. And then I'm also putting a bit on the exposed parts of the hand there on the left. Now, with that done, I've got all my flats ready. So I'm actually starting the background now. The reason I'm doing it in this order is I need sort of filled in colors so I can see where on the background the character's going to overlap. Like if you're doing a background, like a painted one, you don't want to spend ages painting detail in on a section that the character's just going to be completely covering anyway. So once I've got the character's line art and flats done, then I'll start working on the background because I'll know where I should and shouldn't put detail in. And so here I've put the sketch for the background up over the top of the flat layer for the background colors, just so I've got a bit of a guideline set there for where to put the tone in. And there I'm adding, I'm not sure whether it was like supposed to be a cutting board or like an induction cooktop. I was looking at a Bunnings catalog. I found the postbox for a reference of like a nice sort of modern kitchen. They'll look terrible, by the way. They're all melamine and white and human misery. They look like estate homes. But one of them looked quite nice, and it had like this thing, and I couldn't tell if it was a chopping board or an induction cooktop, but it is what it is. And so there you saw me do the shading layer, and now I've got my shading layer informed by the color of the flats, because I cloned the flat colors from the background. I lowered the saturation and hue by about 20, and then grouped that to the shading layer. And you'll notice that sort of corrects all the colors to be basically what I want for the shading. And so with that, I can now do a second shading layer, and I can go over that and add in things like detail. So I'll a lot of time do my backgrounds, like simple backgrounds, by doing the base areas of tone, like color, like the wood bit, the stone bit, the whatever bit, and then I'll do my basic shadows, my big cast shadows, and then on a separate shading layer, I'll do my details like wood grain, ambient occlusion, and compartmentalizing the background for myself works quite well. I'm not very good at doing holistic practice where you just do the whole sort of background in one layer, like, oh, I know this is this slightly more blue version of gray, this is this slightly more gray version of blue, and I'll paint that. No, I don't have the future brain necessary for that yet, so I just do it in nice, simple follow steps where I'll do base colors, big shadows, and detailing on separate layers, and that works quite well for me. And the next separate layer you can see I'm doing here is how I'll do the highlights. So I'll do, for instance, to get a sort of a shine there on the plate there, I'll do a big lasso and just work within that to get a nice sort of hard sort of cut edge to make it look reflective. I'm just doing a bit more of the detailing in on the background there, and you can see that looks pretty good. So now, with that, I'll start doing just some basic shapes for foliage in the window. I'm well aware that everything I do here is going to almost entirely disappear with the amount of glowy digital art effects I'm going to put over it to make it look like sort of morning sun. So all I really care about is having big, simple leaf shapes to use as a silhouette to be used in the background. And quite often I'll do well with drawing them in and then free transforming them in smaller or skewing them and sort of compressing those shapes. That tends to work pretty well for me. So with that, I've got a lot of my base bits. I'm just doing a little bit more detailing there now that I can see it in context with where the character is going to sit. And now I'm doing a selection based on all of the shading I've got. And now with that, so this is how you do sort of subsurface scattering or some color flaring in shadows. I've got a new layer that's set to screen that's using the selection of the shading layer as its opacity mask. So what that means is I can only make it lighter where there was shadows, which is why there's that light fringing there. And then this is just a quick color hierarchy layer over the top where I've just got a bit of sort of yellowy glow and a bit of sort of dark blue just to make things warmer close to where the light's reflecting and cooler further away. Now back onto the character. So I've layered a multiply layer of a sort of purple color over the top and I'm just carving some out. So essentially I'm adding highlights subtractively. So I've made a shading layer and now I'm carving out from it. That can work really well for things like a nighttime scene where you just do all of the flats, dump a big sort of low saturation bluish color over the top, and then carve it out. That'll naturally make the bits you carve out look more yellow when compared to the blue. So the next thing I'm doing here is the shading layer for the light in the room. So this is sort of ambient light with a bit of shadows. Like they're not hard cast shadows, but they're sort of ambient shadows. So what I mean by that is there would be a light source inside the room, like we're probably thinking like a soft indoor light. And so you would have sort of cast shadows for where that ambient sort of soft light from above can't reach. And since I'm doing this in a sort of cell shading style, it'll have kind of a hard edge to it. And there I'm just tuning the color of that overall shading. I'm just focusing now on getting some of those shapes in, like the creases under the arm for the fabric, and a little bit of shading on the side of the right boob there. The other thing you'll notice is I'll quite often put some shading in, like a lot of shading in, and then I'll erase it out. That's one of the benefits of working digital over something like watercolor. You can work back and forth, in and out with your shading, so it can be really good to do some shapes by subtracting tone out, and some shapes is better to do them by drawing them in. And these ones here, you can see the bottom of the shirt there, I wanted them kind of pale, so I decided to do them with the lasso tool. And so I define the shape with the lasso tool and then softly go over it. And so here I'm doing a bit of shading on the nose and eyes. And so now I'm just tuning the color of the shading. So you notice that the shading is no longer that purple. So what I've done is similar to with the background. I made a copy of my flats layer and then I clipped that to my shading layer. And I then got that copy of the flats layer, a color controlling layer, and I set the hue down by 20, the luminosity down by 20. This is what I call the sort of smarter shading layer. It saves you a lot of time with getting the shading color right. I talk about this in my post-processing video, which I don't know if YouTube will let me link to this many different videos of mine. So if it'll let me link to this many, I will put a link to it here. If not, then you can just find it on the channel. It's the one with the lady with the brown skin, red swimsuit, and like dark hair, and it's the one that has the post-processing in it, so it's in that one. And so just doing the cups there, a bit of shading on them. Now I've also decided to put a bit more color variation on the ears. I went a bit sort of hard on them on a separate layer, and that way I can sort of decide what they look like at their most differentiated, and then I can sort of tone that down by lowering the opacity and still keep some of that pink coming through. And so now I'm just finishing up some of the shading around things like the hands as well. And that's my basically the first shading layer there done. And now tuning in the color of the shading on the shirt manually. The smart shading will get you probably 80% of the way there, but not 100%. And now I'm adding highlights to the cup, but I'm not actually adding highlights. I'm just erasing out some of the shading, which will also be the same net effect. So it's worth remembering that highlights exist in comparison to what they're around. So a highlight doesn't have to be a thing where you add white. A highlight can just be where you take away some of the shading you've already got, because not all highlights have to go all the way to white. So in this case, the cup is already a pale grey, so taking some out. And here you can see I'm going over with a second shading layer for just the darkest bits. Typically the secondary shading layer will follow just ambient occlusion, since that's a sort of separate light source that everything can use. Again, YouTube may not let me link to this many of my videos in one video, but I do have a tutorial on how to do shading and how to differentiate between things like surface shadows, ambient occlusion, etc. I'll link it here if I can, but again, if I can't, you can grab it on the video. It's the one with the nice, the lady in the sundress with the red hair and the big hat. And here I'm doing that extra little bit of highlight layer that's going to be the light coming from the window. And I'm doing that with the lasso tool. The reason why the lasso tool is really great for highlights is it has literally a perfectly clean, hard edge to it. And so with that now lassoed in, set of highlight layer there, what I'll do is I'll fill that in on a new layer. So once I've got that bit of the tail there, that's done. And a little bit extra on the tail, a little bit on the hair on the left side and the left hand. Put in with a soft airbrush. I'll change the blend mode to glow, and then put that overall shading layer back on. And now you can see I've got a real sense of lit and unlit. And so that's the first step to having that sort of strong sense of lighting from the window. And now I'll come in and do a bit of highlights on the character with how the highlights would read from the light in the room they're in. But again, I'm not going to go full white with these. These are just highlights to show the highlight of them relative to the room that they're in. So I'll put a little bit on the coffee there, and maybe a little bit on the thigh as well, and making sure I don't go too close to white, so just erasing some back out, because I want it to read as a shine, which will be an area of lighter tone with a hard edge, but I don't want it to read as like a really bright highlight, because that won't make any sense. The brightest light and highlight is going to be on the hair from the window there, so I don't want that to be sort of overshadowed by light from them in the room they're in, because the room they're in will not be as bright. But to show that tone of the room they're in, I'm going to have to essentially overexpose or simulate overexposure in the window that's behind them. And so here you can see I've made a colored line art layer by getting a copy of my flats and putting it over the top of the line art. And now I'm doing that glow from the window on a layer at the very, very top. So it'll glow over the top of even the line art in a sort of yellow color. The reason why I've got it set to glow is that that will increase the saturation as it gets brighter, which is really useful. And the next thing I want to do is I'm going to make a duplicate of the entire image. So duplicate, like copy everything to new layer, merge to new layer. I'll have that layer on top. I'll then do two things to it. I'll blur it, and I'll do a levels adjustment. What this does is it lets me have a layer that will essentially work similarly to increasing the contrast, but instead of working on a pixel by pixel contrast increase, it will instead increase the contrast in regions. So since I got it and I blurred it, that means overall there will be bright bits, overall there will be dark bits, but it won't be going off whether this individual pixel was light or dark. And then I'll set it to overlay over the top and tune the opacity of that layer, and that way I can get, so the effect's not too strong, so it doesn't look too effecty. The next thing I want to do is do a gradient map over the top. This one can be really good for giving you a bit of color cohesiveness. If your image isn't terribly color cohesive initially, it's a great way to sort of push it over the line if it's not quite there. But the other thing it's really good for is setting a mood. So in this case, I wanted a sort of a morning mood, so I wanted some cool purples versus some warm colors. And so that's how I've got the gradient overlay there. And I've set that layer to color as its blend mode. So it's only going to affect the color. It won't affect the tone like the black and white. And that's basically it. Then lastly, I'll just give the image a check over to see if there's anything I've missed. In this case, I'm very glad I did do a checker because I forgot to do the shine on the nose, which is a terrible, terrible sin, as well as a bit of steam for the coffee, just to really give it that sort of that visceral feel to it. Both of those are things I can do over the top of the post-processing. And you can see the way I've done the steam there is some very, very, very quick wiggles with the lasso tool. So with that, we're done. We've got our figure, and you can see that they're consistent with the expressions that we used, that we finished in the first heart, in part 1. And we've got a good sort of feeling of, interaction with the character. We're in a kitchen, so we're in a place, and we have an implied relationship with the subject and the viewer. So they're handing something to us in sort of the first person. And it's definitely better than the initial concept. So that's it. Now, if you like what you see, and you want to learn how to do this yourself, pop over, have a look at part 1 if you've not already. If you have done part 1, remember there is homework to have a go of. So if you do decide to have a go at the homework, I would love to see it. I do get in and look at the homework every time I publish a video, or in every couple of days, try and catch up. And thus far, I'm catching up. I can do it. As the channel grows, that becomes a more and more challenging proposition, but I'm doing it. And I guess if you'd like to support the channel, we have Redbubble. We can buy lots of cool posters of the works. You can like, subscribe. You can ask me any questions you like in the comments. I am very active in the YouTube comments. Sometimes it takes me a while to get back to all of you. But, I tend to get back to probably most people in there. Again, as the channel grows, that does become more challenging, but I am still on top of it now. Still managing. So do ask me any questions there. I would love to hear from you, what you reckon, any advice. If you are an accomplished Anthro artist, or you're experienced or a specialist, I would love to hear your opinions on that. I'm coming at this from a very outside perspective, so that would be really interesting to hear. If you want to support the channel, of course, comments, etc., join the Patreon. We have classes that I run on the Patreon. We're likely going to be having the space for new intake in around probably February, seeing how we go. The attrition has been lower than I expected, which is great. People love hanging out and doing the classes, but it means that spots haven't been opening up as quickly as I expected. So I will keep everyone posted with it. Otherwise, I'll see you in the Discord. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next one. You have a good one. Cheers. Bye.